right, let's take a look at Module 3, which deals with scanning networks, which is probably one of the most fundamental activities that we have in ethical hacking. Lots of time spent scanning, doing host discovery, port discovery, service identification, vulnerability identification, OS detection, etc. So this starts our discussion of phase 2 of the hacking cycle, which again is scanning. All right, so the overview of network scanning. Scanning is definitely an active type of activity. We're actively engaging the target. We're sending specific crafted probes to the target and eliciting a very specific response. Now, there's typically 2 basic phases and then some subdivisions, but the first part is host identification. The second part is services, listening ports, OS, protocols, etc. So network scanning refers to a set of procedures for identifying hosts, ports, and services in a network. It is one of the components of the pre-attack phase of intelligence gathering by which an attacker is used to create a profile of the target organization. So this is part of our mapping. It's not necessarily the footprinting and recon phase we just got done talking about in Module 2. It's an extension of that, and we're creating a very detailed map based on the scanning results. The objectives: to discover live hosts, IP addresses, open ports of live hosts. So first order of business is to figure out who's live and who's not live, and we're going to base that typically on a network sweep or a scanning range that we're going to use from the previous module information, the footprint and recon, for the range of IPs to scan. So we're leveraging information retrieved in the previous phase to further explore in phase 2. To discover operating systems and system architecture, you got to know what it is sitting behind that IP address. Simply, hey, this IP is live, it ain't going to get it. You need to know specifics, OS, applications running, protocols, service versions, etc. To discover the services running on the hosts, and then discover vulnerabilities in live hosts. Now, the vulnerabilities, that used to be part of our Module 3 discussion in the earlier versions of CEH. In CEH version 9, the vulnerability analysis it spun off into its own module. We're going to be talking about that actually in Module 5, which deals with vulnerability analysis. But it is a type of scan, although it's a special type of scanner oftentimes that elicits specific responses to specific probes, looking for indicators of known vulnerabilities. All right, as we discussed in Module 2, trace routing discussion, we've got a couple different protocols to play with. We have ICMP, Internet Control Message Protocol. ICMP is broken into 2 categories. You have message types and you have message codes. The type is the reason you receive the message. The code is further clarification why. For example, an ICMP type 3 error or message would be destination unreachable. And then for one of potentially 14 reasons why it was unreachable: port unreachable, network unreachable, and so forth. It doesn't use ports, it uses message types and codes. TCP and UDP are our 2 transport layer protocols. They're the most commonly used in the TCP IP suite. TCP is used more often than UDP. TCP has some advantages over UDP. UDP has some advantages over TCP. But TCP is connection-oriented and it's reliable, so it's typically preferable for communications that require stability and resiliency. Okay, UDP is a little bit less overhead, a lot less overhead, but it's not reliable. It doesn't do sequencing and acknowledgement information like TCP does. So most everything we're scanning or assessing is going to be of the TCP variety. Now, don't get me wrong, there's some really interesting stuff using UDP, but for the most part, TCP is the lion's share of services that we'll be attempting to exploit. The TCP protocol, like everything else, has a specific number of bytes or bits that mean specific information. In digital communications, we have 2 vocabulary words, 1 and a 0. Everything is represented in 1s and 0s. Everything. Big, long strings of 1s and 0s. Parsing or processing those big long strings of ones and zeros makes sense of X number of bits means this, X number of bits means this. Now, we're going to look a little bit more at header information when we get into our sniffing discussion. But for now, suffice it to say, the first 16 bits of a TCP header are source port. The second 16 are destination port. The next 32 bits are sequence number. The next 32 bits are acknowledgement numbers. So that means for a 16-bit value, I have 65,536 possible combinations, 0 through 65,535. So I can have potentially 65,000 plus TCP channels independently, all being used by different services for a unique communications endpoint. You will uniquely identify both sender and receiver in a TCP communication. You're going to couple that with the IP address, and that forms what's referred to as a socket or connection endpoint. Sequence numbers, 32-bit value, 4,274,000,000 and change possible combinations. This uniquely sequences each byte transmitted. So we have a unique sequence number for every 8 bits we send, and we have acknowledgement numbers that map to those sequence numbers sent by the receiving system to let us know, in fact, we did receive these sequences, here's the next one we're ready for. That makes TCP a reliable connection-oriented protocol, which again is preferable for reliable connections and so forth. So we won't worry too much about offsets reserved so much, at least their positioning in the packet. The TCP flags is right about here in the header, and there are 6 flags that we're going to talk about. There's actually a couple more, but we're not going to worry about those too much right now. SYN is used to synchronize a connection. You'll see that during the first and second steps of a connection establishment or a TCP three-way handshake. ACKs are seen throughout the communication. They acknowledge bytes received. Once the TCP connection is established, you will acknowledge and sequence numbers throughout the communications until you're finished. When you're finished and you're ready to terminate a connection, it can be done with an RST packet, which is an abrupt session termination, or a FIN packet, which is a graceful session teardown. Now we'll see a slide that depicts both the three-way handshake and the four-way session teardown, or the abrupt RST here in a couple slides. Urge is a urgency pointer, meaning this packet is urgent, process immediately. And push is a directive to the sending system to send all buffer data immediately. Now, we don't do a whole lot with these in normal conversation. We're going to manipulate these guys a bit in different scan configurations. So we're going to look at what normal traffic looks like, and we're going to look at what exceptions to that or abnormal traffic might look like. And that's one of the premises of intrusion detection, is identifying anomalistic behavior on the network. All right, so that's our initial discussion of TCP flags. All right, the TCP session establishment is a three-way handshake. So the sending system sends a packet with the SYN flag set and initial sequence number, the starting counter for every byte throughout the transmission. There's a unique sequence number on both sides. If the port is open, the receiving system sends back a SYN-ACK, which is its own SYN flag, its own initial sequence number, and an acknowledgement to the sequence number received in the SYN request in the initiation of the handshake. The third step of the process is a final ACK, which acknowledges the sequence number in the second step. Communication is now established. It will remain established until one side or the other sends an RST, there's a four-way FIN dialogue, or the session times out naturally. I expect a SYN-ACK from an open port. I'll get an RST if the port is closed. I'll get no response if the host is down or if it's being filtered. A normal TCP session termination, a graceful session termination, is a FIN sequence. You get a FIN, you get an ACK, you get a FIN, and you get an ACK. So think of it like having a phone conversation, ring, ring, hello, hello, let's talk. Then I terminate the connection by hanging up on you. That's an RST. But if I let you know, hey, I'm done talking now, I got to get off, that's a fin dialog. So at any time, one side or the other can set an RST, and that terminates the connection. All right, normal circumstances. All right, now we're going to look at different ways to detect live hosts, detect open ports, and unique spins on those flag configurations. All right, one of the most fundamental tools in the tool chest is definitely Nmap. Nmap stands for Network Mapper. It is the most useful tool without a doubt and the best return on your investment dollar since it's free. It does pretty much everything you need it to do for host discovery and port discovery for free. The other notable free tool has got to be Wireshark. There are commercial third-party versions of these tools, but at the end of the day, you can't go wrong with a free utility that does most everything you need in one tool. Now, Nmap is my scanning tool of choice. There's also HPing we're going to look at here, a couple labs on it. HPing is also a command line packet crafting utility, but we're going to focus most of the demonstrations on Nmap. All right, Nmap has been around for decades. It runs on every OS you can think of, or Linux, Mac, and so forth, or some sort of port over to it. The Nmap command line utility has some pretty intricate syntax, and there's a GUI version of it called ZenMap that allows you to manipulate it through a GUI. So we're going to show a few demonstrations on Nmap, both from a command line and a GUI. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and start an Nmap scan, and I'm going to run a full intense scan plus UDP against my victim machine. Hit scan and let that cook for a second. That's going to take some time to complete. I'm going to hit the scan button. So we'll let that cook a bit. We're also going to use that scan in our enumeration discussion. All right, then I'm going to open a command line terminal window on my Parrot security box. And we'll do some host discovery, some port scanning for each slide. We'll kind of demonstrate some things as we go along. All right, so Nmap. Most fundamental scanning tool we have. HPing is user preference. Pepsi to Nmap's Coca-Cola. I know some hardcore HPing enthusiasts. It's got lots of great functionality. It does some flooding attacks. The format that comes back in the response screens is very uniform and parallel. It's nice and crisp. But there's another command line network scanning tool, which you will have a couple labs on, but I'm going to hold off on any HPing demos. We're going to do everything under Nmap. All right, host discovery. First order of business is to figure out what hosts are actually live on the network. Now, we've got a range of IP addresses that can be in three basic flavors or sizes. You have a Class A network, which has 16.8 roughly million hosts. Okay. You have a Class B network, which has 65,000 plus. And you have a Class C network, which has 254 to 256 addresses, but typically 254 hosts. You can reclaim the network ID, et cetera. So 254 to 56, including the broadcast address. So scanning those ranges will save you some time from probe or port scanning hosts that actually aren't live. Scans can take a considerable amount of time to run, depending on how much information you're requesting. So first order of business is to figure out what hosts aren't going to respond to begin with and eliminate those from future scans. Host discovery techniques are typically called ping sweeps or network sweeps. A ping sweep doesn't have to be ICMP. It's anything that elicits a pong for your ping. For example, a TCP connect or a UDP packet. If they elicit a response, gotcha, you responded, you must be a live host. So there are different host discovery techniques. You have ARP ping scan, UDP, ICMP, TCP, IP protocol scans. Call those the raw socket switch. You have subcategories for ICMP, echo request, timestamp request, or netmask request, and an echo ping sweep under the ICMP echo. In TCP, you can use SYN pings or ACK pings. So we're going to go through the behavior as stated in the RFC for TCP/IP, and we'll look at some exceptions to that, and we'll look at looking for anomalistic responses as well. But the most reliable scan type is going to be an ARP ping scan, because you typically will not disable address resolution protocol. ARP, whole purpose in life, is to resolve MAC addresses for IP addresses, right? So you have temporary addresses in the form of a host name, you have temporary addresses in the form of an IP address, and you have permanent addresses in the form of a MAC address that will resolve those host names to IPs, ultimately to MAC address. You will typically not disable address resolution protocol, meaning you will respond to ARP requests unless you're using static configurations in your network, which is a whole lot of administrative nightmare. So it typically doesn't happen. Everything else has the potential to be firewalled or restricted. ARP does require that you're on the same subnet as the host that you're scanning. Otherwise, you can't get to them. It's a layer 2 protocol, and it's constrained or confined to the local subnet. If Nmap determines that the IP address it's scanning is on the same subnet, it will default to an ARP ping because it's the most reliable. We also have UDP, ICMP, and of course, different flavors of ICMP, the timestamp, the address mask, and the TCP ping scan. All right, there are multiple ways to skin a cat, multiple ways to discover host. So in my Parrot box, I can do this quite simply, Nmap S capital P for ping scan 10.0.0.0/24, and I will scan my entire subnet. Okay, that's a quick ping sweep. And the scan type was quite simply just ping. Now, if you don't specify, Nmap will fill in the detail for you. I could just do an Nmap 10.0.0.200, for example, and it's going to default to a basic scan, top 1,000 ports, give me the MAC address, give me the basics. All right, your Nmap syntax is testable information. Everything in this course is fair game for the exam. The Nmap syntax specifically causes some people problems because it can seem kind of overwhelming to begin with. Now, you're not responsible for every Nmap switch, but you're going to want to know the basics for scan type, host discovery, timing options, aggressive script scanning, and we've got labs that are going to walk you through examples of those types of scans. So if I do an Nmap TAC capital PI 10.0.0.0/24, that's an ICMP ping sweep. The capital P is for ping type, the capital I is for ICMP. I can also do an E for echo, I could do an M for net mask, I could do a P for timestamp. All right, so there's my results. And actually came back with the port numbers on each host as well. Now I could tell it no port scan to do an SN on that and limit it to specifically, TAC SN to host discovery and get the same results I got back with the ping scan. All right, now there are cheat sheets out there for Nmap syntax, but I'm going to show you some of the basics and you're going to get some practice with this in your labs as well. All right, so the discoveries. Capital P, uppercase R for ARP, uppercase U for UDP, uppercase E for ICMP, uppercase E for echo, P for timestamp, M for net mask, and then the TCP, you have S for SYN ping, and you have A for ACK ping. So we'll talk a little bit more about SYNing and ACKing here in the next few slides and the normal behavior for an unsolicited ACK or an unsolicited SYN request. All right, so your host discovery techniques, in plenty of ways to discover a host, some more reliable potentially than others. Now with ICMP, there's more of a tendency for things to be filtered in ICMP, especially at perimeter devices, bordered your networks, and that sort of thing. All right, actually, right now I think is a good time to go over the behaviors. And again, the new version 12 has the slides laid out a little bit differently, and I'm kind of a creature of habit. I do certain discussions at certain slides, but just occurred to me our normal version of this is now consolidated in this table, so we're going to talk about it right now. Okay, normal response for an ARP ping is to respond with an ARP request or an ARP response. An ARP is directed to your IP address used to resolve a MAC address. Okay, UDP is the possibility of a destination unreachable ICMP message shows that the port's closed, but we do either expect a response in the form of data or expect an error message. Now, lack of a response is also a possibility, which means the UDP ping scan can be a little bit unreliable. Okay, the echo request. An ICMP echo request is actually a type 8 request. It elicits a response of a type 0 and an echo reply. All right, an echo ping, again, is a type 0. All right, the timestamp request is a capital P. All right, a timestamp is meant to estimate transit time and so forth. Response is conditional, may or may not respond in the time value, but you're supposed to see a reply to it. So timestamp request gets a timestamp response. Address mask is meant to identify the subnet address mask for determining IP addressing ranges and subnetting. Okay, may is conditional, may or may not respond with the appropriate subnet value, but both of these are alternatives to the echo, which is the most likely to be filtered since it's been heavily misused over the years. Echo requests are using ping floods, host identification enumeration, so you might try the timestamps or the net mask. SYN ping. If I send a TCP SYN request and the host is live, I expect a response, a SYNAC, if the host is active, and I expect actually an RST packet if the host is, if the port itself is not open. If the host is inactive, I get no response. So I expect from a live host either a SYNAC or an RST, depending if the port's open or closed. All right, the ACK ping. If I send you an unsolicited ACK packet, I expect an RST response if the host is active, no response if the host is inactive. But if that thing is live, it responds with an RST. An IP protocol scan. This is the raw socket switch. You're actually pinging the protocol itself. IP, ICMP, IGMP, etc. Actually pinging the protocol. Hey, TCP, are you there? And it responds. All right, port scanning techniques. There's a few different ways to enumerate listening ports on an active device, but once we've determined what hosts are live, then we go forward with our port scanning. Otherwise, you're spinning your wheels, sending connection requests to hosts that aren't even live to begin with, let alone don't have a listening port. All right, port and service discovery. We're going to focus on TCP and UDP. We're not going to worry about SCTPs or SSDP or IPv6 right now. Now, I'll come back to IPv6 a little bit, but we see a lot of IPv4 in networks, even though IPv6 has been out for years. I got a little story about that. We're going to circle back to it. TCP, you have open TCP scanning methods like the TCP connector full open. Now, I can run that as a non-root user or non-administrator, typically on any operating system. Anything that involves a modification of the normal connection handshake will require root privilege. For example, stealth or other types of inverse scans. Stealth TCP, where you're manipulating the handshake, not doing the full three-way dialogue, is going to require root privilege or administrator system access. That falls into a half-open scan, inverse scans, or ACK flag probe scans. The inverse fall into Christmas tree, fin, null, and Maimon scans, and the ACK flag probe falls into TTLs and Windows scans. There's another kind of oddball scanning method called the idle or IPID header scan that bases its determination of whether a port was open or not indirectly by using an idle host and eliciting its IP identifiers in response packets to determine if a unknown packet was sent out between the two initial probes. I'm going to get into that. All right, we're not going to worry about SCTP inits or cookie echo scanning right now. We got plenty to chew on with the basics of TCP and UDP. All right, the TCP connector full open scan, three-way handshake. All right, I expect a SYN-ACK if the port is open. I expect an RST if the port is closed. No response means that port is filtered. It's not responding as it's supposed to. Something is blocking it, but I expect one or the other from a live host. The stealth scan. The stealth scan, I expect a SYN-ACK just like the full open connect scan. The stealth scan used to be stealthy. It's definitely going to be detected by intrusion detection these days, but it doesn't establish the connection and it doesn't actually get logged as a connection. It's a half-open connection that's torn down on the third step versus a final act to complete the handshake. The inverse scan falls into multiple subcategories. An inverse scan doesn't work against Windows systems. They don't follow the RFC 793 for IP, which states that illegal flag configurations should be ignored by an open port. So when you send weird flag configurations, an unsolicited FIN urgent push, which is a Christmas tree scan, or the null scan, which are no flags set, no response from an open port. Reset packet response from a closed port. Windows gives you an RST in both scenarios, meaning it's useless for Windows systems. The Christmas tree scan is a flavor of inverse scan. It's the FIN urgent push flag set, kind of lit up like a Christmas tree, although it's 3 out of 6 flags. And again, no response if the port is open, RST if the port's closed. All right, the FIN scan, null scan. There's still versions of inverse scans. FIN scan would be like this. Me walking up to you in the street and going, goodbye. You're like, goodbye. We never said hello. The FIN scan, I'm finishing a connection I haven't established yet. That's weird. Illegal flag configuration. No response from an open port, RST from a closed port. Null scan. How are you going to have a TCP packet with no flag set? That's just weird. Also an illegal flag configuration, also elicits no response. Okay, the Maimon scan is a FIN-ACK initial probe, same idea. No response, port is open, ICMP unreachable, port is filtered, or RST packet if port's closed. All right, additional scans, the ACK flag probe scan. Okay, this gets into potentially mapping out firewall rule sets. So I expect an RST packet response. If I don't get one, that port is filtered. You have a stateful firewall or firewall in general that's blocking the response traffic. There's also TTL based, where you see boundary condition issues or non-zero window sizes, which can also indicate a filtered port. And then the idle or IPID header scan is a series of probes to a zombie system looking for differences in the IP ID incrementation, which is kind of a weird one. All right, so window-based idle IPID header scan, UDP scan. Okay, no response if the port is open or data back, and ICMP unreachable error if the port is closed. All right, we're not going to worry about the SCTP inits or the cookie scans yet. Again, we've got plenty to cook on with UDP and TCP for the time being. Then we get into service version discovery, but before we do that, let's run a couple scans. All right, now I love to use my original CEH victim machine from CEH version 4 when I first started training on CEH and first started teaching it. So you can see I've actually got to walk down memory lane here. I've got the current lab environment for 12. I still need to build it. I don't have a Server 2022 OS right now, but this is back prior to Kali Linux, my Windows 2000 victim, my 2003 attacker, my 2008, my 2012, 2016, 2019, and Windows 10. I still love to use my Windows 2000 box for demos because it's a lot to look at on one target. It is a target-rich environment. So I've gotten kind of the habit of using it for most of my demos. Now it is a older, unpatched Windows 2000 box, But most of what I'm showing you in these demos has nothing to do with the fact it's a dated operating system. Some of it does, but I also keep it around to show you historical concepts that we don't necessarily see anymore. And we get into vulnerability scanning, we're going to see this guy is just loaded up with vulnerabilities. But I'll tell you what, I'll do a little variation on this. Nmap, TAC, scan type, TAC ST 10.0.0.200. Okay, there's my TCP ports. Now, Nmap will also make some choices for you, some decisions for you. If I don't tell it which ports to scan, it's going to scan the top 1,000. And I'm not talking 0 through 999. I'm talking about the top 1,000 most popular ports. So 25, 80, 135, 1028, 3372, 6666. You can give it a top number, X number, and it's based on statistical usage of the ports. But if you don't tell it, it fills in some blanks for you. It also shows 989 closed ports. All right, so that's attack ST. If I do attack SS, that's a SYN stealth. All right, same results. If I do attack capital S A, all right, that's actually just discovery. Shows the ports are unfiltered. It's getting responses back. If I do attack capital S U, now it scans UDP, which it didn't do by default. So those UDP ports are definitely interesting. If you don't scan UDP, you're going to miss some good stuff. Nmap, again, makes decisions for you. So you need to tell it SU to scan UDP. So your syntax for the scan type is a lowercase s capital first letter of the scan type. Your syntax for the discovery type for pinging is a capital P and then capital first letter of the scan type, or a couple sub-variations of that. All right, but notice that I didn't get a lot of specifics on what's actually doing the listening on those ports. I get basics like SMTP, HTTP, but no specifics. That's where banner grabbing or version detection comes in. Service version discovery, now you start getting specific software versions. This is running something called banner grabs, and the banner grabs will give you specifics where the specifics are disclosed. We'll do attack SV. And that's actually going to take a bit, since the banner grabs are a little bit more information. It waits for some timeouts, but it will come back with some specifics, specific software versions. So right now, SMTP, well, heck, that could be anything. That's just a mail server. Well, what kind of mail server? HTTP, what HTTP daemon? Is it Apache? Is it IIS? Is it Nginx? What is it? All right, Microsoft RPC, we pretty much know that's Microsoft. And then some of these versions will help you with OS identification. Again, still running. And OS fingerprinting. All right, actually, let's take a look at my ZenMap scan, because this has already done some banner grabbing for me. All right, so scroll on up. And now I've got specific version numbers. And again, this is a walk down memory lane here, ESMTP 5.0.2172.1. It doesn't get any more specific than that. I then Google vulnerabilities, Microsoft ESMTP 5.0.2172.1, and bam, I get specific vulnerabilities for that specific version. Now, it is possible that the banner configurations are changed to mislead the attacker. It's not very probable though. And they do have suppression of the banners that can actually be done in the config files. All right, so there's a banner grab, and this guy's done the same thing now. And there's different ways to elicit banners. You can actually use Telnet and Netcat and other banner grabbing utilities. So that's version detection, all right, which gives you specificity on what services are actually listening. All right, OS discovery and banner grabbing. So from a command line, if I do an nmap, TAC S, or TAC capital O, TAC capital O, 10.0.0. say 19, go against my 2019 box here. It's going to do rudimentary OS stack fingerprinting. All right, and I'm going to show you an example here. Oops, back to my Nmap scan. Okay, this guy's initial OS fingerprint, I'm just going to show you some generality here. Okay, OS CPE. Okay, this is either a Windows 2000, 2000 Service Pack 1, 2000 Service Pack 2, Service Pack 3, Service Pack 4, XP Service Pack 1, I don't know. So Windows 2000, one of 4 service packs, or one of 2 service packs XP. That's not very specific, all right? So that's fairly general. When you do the script scan, it's not doing the discovery again. That's weird. For some reason on this box, my script scanning doesn't always run. So I'm going to run that actually manually. Again, another weird issue, when I copy virtual machines, you would think that they work the same way on one machine or the other, but there's something with the network configuration that goes wonky on that. All right, so how to identify a target system OS? We're going to circle back to that. Actually, let me do this. All right, do new profile command. Get rid of all this. We're going to do scripting. We're going to do I'm going to run it manually here. I might just create a profile for it. Lost track of what I was doing here. There we go. All right, so rudimentary stack fingerprinting. Okay, this is really basic stuff. But if I was to get the TTL of a packet, then if it's 64, I know it's Linux. Okay, if it's 128, I know it's Windows. If it's 255, it's Solaris or Cisco iOS. If you see a 32, you're looking at a museum piece, an old NT40 or Windows 95. So the TTLs and the TCP window sizes can be specific to different versions of the OS, but it's not very precise. So you're better off using the Nmap scripting engine like the script SMB OS Discovery NSE. So let me actually run that. See what we do a profile here. I'm going to go ahead and create the profile. And this should be part of all your aggressive options. CDP didn't get it though. All right, scripting, SMB, server message block protocol. There it is, OS Discovery. All right, I'm going to save this as demo. Save changes. All right, now I'm going to target my demo, script SMB OS Discovery, and we're going to run it again. Now, this will give me based on, there we go, specifically Windows 2000, 2000 LAN Manager. If I run that against 19 and scan, let's do 16 then. There we go. All right, that gives me a specific, run as 19 is giving me problems. 2016 standard 6.3, very specific based on the server message block protocol versioning. So that's where things get a lot more precise than your general OS fingerprinting. So I can go for generalities or specificities when I start targeting specific software versions. So SMB OS Discovery, definitely useful for identifying specifically what version of the operating system I'm looking at, especially with Windows systems. All right, before we go much further, I feel like we got to talk about the idle or IPID scan because they don't really have a dedicated slide for it anymore. But since I mentioned it and mentioned it's kind of an oddball, let's run through it. So here's my server that I want to scan. And for whatever reason, let's say that I'm not allowed to scan it. It's firewalled, or I don't want to get detected. Evil Lego guy. I don't want to get detected as the scanning host. All right, so let's say I pick a network printer, for example, with a IP address of 10.0.0.6. Let's say the server I want to scan is 10.0.0.19. Let's say that I am 10.0.0.13. All right, I don't want to get identified as the one scanning this box. So instead, I'm going to make it look like the zombie or the idle host is sending the request. So I'm going to spoof my zombie or idle host IP, and I'm going to first probe with a SYNAC and get a response back from the zombie. It will have a current IP ID or IP identifier, which is an sequentially incrementing counter for every outbound datagram. Say its current IPID is 5. All right, so that's its high water mark. I send a SYN request to the server, but I spoof the zombie's IP. So the SYN, if that port is open, elicits a response of a SYNAC, but not to me, to the zombie's IP. If a SYNAC comes in, it responds the same way it did to my initial request and sends back an RST and increments the IPID. Our IPID is now 6. I then reprobe it and I look at the response. If the IPID has incremented by 2, oops, that's a horrible B, sorry about that, has incremented by 2, then a response was sent to my spoofed SYN request, indicating the port's open. If an RST packet is sent, this doesn't have to happen. It doesn't increment an IPID, and the IPID is not 7, it's 6. So it's based on IPID values and incrementation, which is brilliant in thinking outside of the box, but I have a tendency to suspect that idle host is communicating to other hosts that I don't know about. So I don't have a whole lot of trust or faith in just counting the IPIDs outbound. But they mentioned it. We don't have a dedicated slide for it anymore, so I figured I'd run through it in case you're wondering what an idle or IPID header scan is. All right, so internet scripting engine, and then IDS and firewall evasion. Okay, IDS evasion is generally not a huge concern for an ethical hacker since we're authorized to be there. Now, for a conventional hacker, intrusion detection system means they get caught, which means they may actually get arrested and go to jail, or at the very least, their port gets shunned and they get kicked off and they're not discovered. So tiptoeing around takes time, and taking evasive precautions in a pen test will actually increase the duration and the billable hours. It becomes a more expensive test if you're supposed to walk around on eggshells. So usually when you communicate that to your client, they say, oh, okay, we'll just go for it and find the holes and we'll fix it. Don't worry about not getting detected. Now, that's not always the case, but when you start looking at the cost difference, a lot of times they elect to just let you go for it. So IDS or file evasion is also necessary potentially to complete an attack or to exploit a system. So evading IDS is basically not matching an intrusion signature. So we should take a look at an IDS signature. We're going to take a look at these a little bit later, again, specifically in evading IDS firewalls and honeypots, the module. But for purposes of our initial discussion, we need to take a look at a snort rule. So here's an example, and I still have my V11 demo tools here. Here's an example of a exploit rule, which is used to configure Snort, which is an intrusion detection system, to detect different types of attacks. All right, so at the core of a lot of this is just pattern matching. So when I look for content, like all of this, I'm looking for what is encapsulated between the double quotes. So C000, that's just hexadecimal data. I'm looking for it at an offset of 12 and a depth of 2. So bytes 12 and 13 in the packet, if they match this pattern matching, ding, 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 that's an intrusion signature. All right, bin SH, okay, looks for something trying to spawn a shell. 90, 90, 90, 90, 90, 90, 90, 90, that's a NOP sled, possibly buffer overflow. All right, different hex signatures for different shellcode signatures, but that's the basics of an intrusion detection signature. So all I have to do is not match this signature and preserve the functionality. Then I become evasive. Now, if an IDS is not reassembling its packets, then fragmentation will split these signatures out into multiple packets, and no single packet triggers the IDS. IDSs these days will invariably do some degree of stream reassembly, so you don't rely on that 100%. Okay, non-stateful filters, ACLs on Cisco routers, things like that, that don't actually do reassembly, this is potentially evasive. Your, hardcore IDS will do stream reassembly and reassemble fragments. All right, then there's not matching the signature using a functionally equivalent alternative. So bin SH, for example, which this is not a great example since Linux is case sensitive, but if you had a capital BIN, capital SH, technically it doesn't match the lowercase bin SH, and if the system still interprets it correctly, you're evasive. So we're going to pick up on that discussion in Evading IDS Firewalls and Honeypots. We have a whole module for it. It's coming up in module 12. But for now, I wanted to give us the basics of what IDS bases its decisions on. Now, that's just signature-based. There's anomaly and heuristics and a bunch of other variations of that. The problem with signature-based is you have to tell it specifically what you're looking for. It's less likely to produce false positives, but at the same time, you have to tell the system exactly what it's looking for. So it doesn't catch unknown attacks. That's the basic issue with signature-based detection. And the same thing with your antivirus. Okay, very similar. So back to the slides then on that. For evading a firewall or evading IDS, you have to make it not see the signature. So packet fragmentation in a scanning engine will split up the probe packets into fragments, sending to the network. So you're splitting up the header, little bitty pieces, and if it doesn't reassemble them, it doesn't see the criteria that it's looking for. So Nmap with attack F is the switch for fragmentation. All right, source routing. All right, so we need to have the discussion of IP address spoofing. Can I spoof an IP address? Yes. Can I spoof it and behave just like a host at that IP address? Not necessarily. Could I send you a letter from a spoofed a return address? Absolutely. But if I wanted you to send me a letter back, would I receive it? No. All right, so in one-sided attacks, spoofing an IP address is no big deal. In two-sided attacks, it's a huge deal because when you send a response back to it, it's going to go to the network where that IP address resides, not me, the one spoofing, unless I'm on the same subnet and using active sniffing techniques to intercept it. So source routing is a possibility. It's not that likely to be successful because most routers will not honor source routing, but the packet itself dictates the journey that it takes through the network. For example, I would spoof my source address, but I'd put a list of routers that I want the packet to travel through in the header, and I would list myself as one of the routers. That way, on the return trip, the packet gets routed to me as a router in the route list. I just pick it up off the wire and don't forward it. So I'm intercepting it along the way and still spoofing the source address. So here's what that looks like, just so we can say we've seen it. I'm going to open a command window, ping-tat-j, all right, and I'm just creating, oops, yeah, capital's not going to work. Just that caps lock on here. I'm going to Wireshark that so we can actually see the packet. And I'm going to filter by ICMP. And capturing will go. Filter by ICMP, and then run my ping. And I don't think it likes the caps here either. There you go. All right, so out it goes. And you can actually see in the options a loose source route specified. Now I just cranked out any old route. Now typically these would be different IPs on different subnets because they're supposed to indicate different routers. But in a nutshell, I would spoof my IP somewhere up here, and then my actual IP is somewhere in the route. So on the way back, doing, it hops to me, 10006. I pick it up off the wire, packet intercepted. So there's loose and there's strict source routing. We don't really need to split and differentiate between the two, but most routers are probably not going to pay attention to that. So no self-respecting router is going to let any packet dictate its course through the network. They'll make the decision based on destination address, and that's the way we do it. But it's a possibility. All right, so source routing. Source port manipulation. I may not be able to scan in through a firewall, but I may actually manipulate source ports to allowable traffic. For example, port 80. Now, typically a firewall allows traffic inbound from port 80 because if you're browsing the web from inside the perimeter, port 80 traffic has to be able to come on back in, right? So I may actually be able to configure Nmap to use port 80 instead of the default, which I think is still 7. Look at that. Using the GR source port option allows you to specify the port. This may actually allow the traffic through the firewall. So depending on the firewall rules, HTTP, DNS, FTP, etc., you might be allowed in. Then there's IP address decoys. So that's just like it sounds. Decoy is meant to distract or throw you off the path, cover your tracks by providing bogus IP addresses in with your scans littered in there for randomness. So you're sending out a scan from 10 random hosts and your IP is actually one of those. It makes it difficult to determine who's doing the scan. So randomization can be specifics, decoy 1, decoy 2, decoy 3, etc., or you can have it pick random addresses in a specific number. So that also allows you to hide the source of the scan by using decoy addresses, which mean you have to track down each decoy. All right, then IP address spoofing, which we've already started this discussion. Can I spoof my IP address? Yes. One-sided attacks, I probably want to spoof it so that they can't be shut down. SYN floods, for example, which we'll talk about in the denial of service module. SYN floods are from random IP addresses, so you can't just block the inbound connection from a specific IP. So IP spoofing with HPing3, you can actually, HPing3, very robust command line packet crafter. You can specify the source address if you like. You can do it with scripts, Python scripts and things like that as well. But specifying the source address can be done manually, or you can also script that to be randomized. So interactive session, no dice, non-interactive session, game on, and can actually help the attack since you can't block a specific IP. All right, then we get into the proxy server discussion. Okay, proxy servers in general are stand-ins. Proxy's actually a security device. It's a firewall. When you communicate to the outside world from a proxy, the outside world thinks it's talking to the proxy and not you. So 209.1.1.1, say I'm browsing a website. There we go. www.ebay.com. And here I am inside the perimeter. That's a horrible host. at 10.0.0.200, when I communicate outbound through the proxy's IP address replaces mine, and the connection is made from the proxy to the resource. On the return trip, it's then turned back to my IP address and sent in, but this guy knows nothing about my internal address. The proxy also gives you the ability to filter and restrict and inspect, and there's different reasons for using proxies. Right now, we're worried about anonymization. A single proxy, however, could be potentially compromised. Its log files could be retrieved. It could indicate who it's proxying for. So your conventional web proxy, circuit level gateway, we're going to talk more about that in module 12, but a single stand-in may actually be compromised, show the source of the internal host. Multiple proxies, on the other hand, probably not so much. There's also the possibility that one of these proxies could be controlled by a malicious third party or government agency or, say, law enforcement. Now, for hackers, that's bad news. They don't want to use a honeypot that's put out as a free proxy that's actually controlled by a government organization or law enforcement. So they will typically use, as an ethical hacker, we probably don't care. Proxies will really just slow us down more than anything else. Running through a series of proxy servers, there's a slowing down of the traffic due to the processing from proxy to proxy. But the proxy server's purpose in life is to serve as an intermediary and to anonymize or restrict or filter. All right, free proxy servers should probably be avoided, since who knows who controls those things. And actually, in general, whenever you hand over your stuff to a third party, whoever that may be, your cellular provider, your ISP or whatever, you're really relinquishing control to that entity. And who knows what they're doing with the traffic, or who knows if they've been compromised or tapped into and so forth. So proxy chaining takes the proxy concept to the next level. Okay, you got one proxy, the next proxy, the next proxy, the next proxy, the next, and the next. Each proxy only knows about the previous proxy. So tracing it back becomes difficult. You have to go from proxy to proxy to proxy to proxy. And the trace back is more involved than a single host. Did you compromise its log files? And it may indicate the requester on the other side. But a static chain can still be traced back. Dynamic circuits that are created on the fly are more secure in the fact that the path itself is different for every subsequent connection attempt, making it more difficult to trace back. But at the end of the day, whenever you're using intermediaries, you're always at the risk of somebody compromising those intermediaries and potentially getting access to your data. Proxy switcher, CyberGhost, VPNs, censorship circumvention tools, anonymizers, they're all doing roughly the same thing. You're sending your data through an intermediary server that then swaps out its IP for yours to keep you anonymous, but at the same time, it gives them access to your traffic. Now, a little bit later on, we're going to talk about on-path attacks and man-in-the-middle attacks. We are trying to get people to connect through us. We're inviting them to connect through us so that we can intercept their traffic. Later on, we'll use proxies proper in web application discussions for session hijacking and web application analysis so that we can intercept and modify traffic or take over sessions. So the term proxy has a few different contexts that we're going to use it in throughout the course. For now, it's about remaining anonymous. Later on, it's going to be a tool for identifying web application vulnerabilities. All right, so every so often, my phone rings and it's my dad. He says, we're going to talk about VPNs. I'm like, we already talked about VPNs. Dad, you already have one. He's like, yeah, but is it any good? It's like, well, as we discussed before, you're at the mercy of the provider. So he's using Nord, which is pretty reputable. But at the end of the day, who knows if they've been compromised, if there's insider threats or whatever. So don't ever do anything that you don't want to get caught for, and you should never have to worry about it. There's the short answer. But anonymizers can also be implemented in the interest of free speech, preserving our privacy. Here in the United States, we enjoy a degree of privacy that you may not find everywhere on the planet, and we don't want to lose that. So without getting into soapbox discussion of privacy and terrorist activity and so forth. I'll leave it at that. But there are various ways to remain anonymous. There's also various ways to get caught using the anonymizer. So let's just leave it at that. The anonymizer, CyberGhost, P2P, or Tor browsers and so forth, they all again rely on the security of those intermediaries. So when we talked about the Tor browser in the footprint and recon discussion, the Tor browser is designed to anonymize your web browsing. And it's supposed to keep you off the radar, and your IPs can't be logged by certain websites. But at the same time, that Tor network was actually implemented originally by the US Department of Navy. So it starts off its origins in government. And actually, if you control an exit node, you can intercept the traffic. We won't have a huge discussion about that. But if you don't control it directly, you don't control it directly. You're always at the risk of somebody intercepting your data if you're using a third-party intermediary. So just leave it at that. All right, IP spoofing detection techniques. Okay, so if I'm spoofing my IP address, can you catch me doing that? Sure. Something will look weird about those spoofed addresses. Now, again, the likelihood of you doing this successfully, so spoofing an IP address and getting an interactive session and session hijack and injection is pretty low in the grand scheme of things. But if I'm spoofing an IP address, my TTLs will be different. Our victim here has an active connection. Her TTLs are 25. The attacker spoofing the IP address, TTLs coming in at 13. That's a 12-hop variance. That's substantial. Now, 1 or 2 here or there, depending on routes through the internet, but 12, come on, that's obviously a spoofed packet. There's also IP identification numbers. So the IPID values, like we talked about in the IPID header scan, when you see a completely different range. Now, these are sequentially incrementing. So they do advance, but when you see a range of 515 versus 2586, that's a huge difference in the ranges. So that would also indicate potentially a spoofed IP address. All right, then you've got the TCP flow control method. So if the spoofing IP continues to send packets in after exhausting the window size, that indicates they're not receiving the window size negotiations or the window size in the outbound packets from the target. So all 3 of those can be used to determine potentially suspicious traffic, implementing some sort of IP spoofing. All right, now that's the beginning of the discussion of evading IDS. We have a whole module on that coming up a little further down the road, so stay tuned for more on IDS evasion and firewall evasion and fragmentation. We're going to break that down a little bit more. All right, so that is going to wrap up the scanning module. Really, really important skill set. One of the first things I recommend you focus on after your first pass through the course and after you pass your exam is getting really comfortable with your scanning tools. Now, there's more to talk about in scanning because enumeration and vulnerability scanning are also more or less scans. They're more invasive, potentially, and then vulnerability scanners will specifically probe for known vulnerabilities. So that used to be part of the scanning module, and it's its own module. We're going to be talking about that 2 modules from now in Module 5. So for now, we've talked about host discovery, we've talked about ports, we've talked about service discovery, OS fingerprinting, we talked about anonymizing, covering tracks to a degree, which that actually comes up as the last stage of the hacking cycle, at least being evasive. And we've laid some groundwork for our evading IDS firewalls and honeypots module. All right, lots of great labs for you on this one. So enjoy the labs, pay special attention to the Nmap syntax. You're gonna want to have that as a working knowledge base. You don't have to memorize all of it, but you need to understand the basics. And speaking of which, let me run back through that one more time. All right, so just to kind of lay it all out, Nmap, let's do a clear screen here. All right, Nmap, the command, TAC S for the scan type, TAC capital P for the discovery type, TAC T and a numerical value for timing options, TAC O, for example, for OS fingerprinting, TAC S capital V for service version detection, and your IP address. Now, the profile creation is also useful for learning Nmap syntax. You're going to be running through a profile creation in the lab, But by creating a profile, you get to walk through all of the scan options and it builds your command line syntax for you. So go to Profile, New Profile, clear the syntax. And as you go through each tab, as you select each option, it builds your syntax in the command line. Very cool. Ping discovery options, scripting discovery, target, timing, scan options. Really useful for learning the switches for different types of scans. All right, and again, you're going to get your feet nice and wet in the labs, get a good feel for host discovery, port scanning, some evasion techniques in the labs that follow this module. All right, so that's going to wrap us up for Module 3 system scanning. Up next will be Module 4 enumeration, and enjoy the labs.